of which we've already answered in email form. There was a thematic issue that was coming up across a bunch of emails, and that is how the directed study guides are graded. The directed study guides are graded using two metrics. The first metric is completion. Is every part of the directed study guide filled out? So in every directed study guide, there are a certain number of prompts, there are a certain number of subheadings and content per directed study guide. And so it's really easy to go through and count those out and say, okay, if there's 25 things you can fill in, and you've only completed 13 of the 25, then you can guess the percentage of points you're going to lose for that, right? Or, to put it positively, the number of points you'll earn by doing 13 of the 25. Likewise, we look at the Unicheck score and then we verify it, okay? One of the things that I'm going to keep pushing is do not copy and paste or type verbatim out of Lumen, out of your textbook. The point for the directed study guides is to help you all study for the comprehensive department established university final exam. It's comprehensive and it's quite challenging. So far, we have the track record in this class of the students in this class score the highest. And it's because I'm the only professor that assigns directed study guides, okay? So the average grade in this class on a difficult comprehensive final is a B+. Okay, so the whole point of the directed study guides is for you all to read the material, translate it into your language, and then write out your interpretation of what it means. So throw in some mnemonic devices if it would help. Like one student was trying to memorize the psychosexual stages of Freud's model of development, and it was this thing about a purple octopus and the fecal practices of, and it made no sense to me when I emailed this, where I commented on the DSG for the student. She broke down her mnemonic device and it was brilliant. And so use these study guides as a way of thinking ahead. Okay, how do I write about this content to myself as I'm taking this comprehensive final? Now, what I would like you all to do is to continue to accrue your directed study guides for yourselves. So as you're studying for the final, you don't have to go through and read back through the entire textbook. That would be onerous, it would be burdensome, it would be stressful. Instead, what you get to do is go through and just review your directed study guides. That's it. It's like taking your entire textbook and condensing it down into a much shorter form. For those of you who are interested in majoring in psychology and those of you interested in becoming therapists, if you want to be a therapist, you will have to take and pass a state or national level comprehensive exam on your field, right? And so how in the world, after you're done with graduate school, are you possibly going to remember everything that you've covered in every course, okay? The average number of times that people have to take the licensure exam to become a psychologist is 4, and every attempt costs $700. Okay, so you might want to think ahead about how you can think about mastering this content. For me, I did what are called directed study guides. Once I was fully licensed as a psychologist, I took my 3 great big old 4-inch 3-ring binders just full of directed study guides and all of my courses, and we had a bonfire. You know what I mean? Like I had mastered that content, I aced the licensure exam first try, and I'm no smarter than the rest of you, okay? It's all about study technique. So I'm trying to corrupt you while you're young, right? In a 10-10 class, here's, for this class, we'll outline the directed study guide for you. But in my other classes, we'll trust you to create your own. And in other classes, in this one, the department kind of controls things, but in all my other classes, you will use your directed study guide as you take the final exam, okay? Right? And so it's a way to really reward and really emphasize the importance of this form of mastery. Okay, I think there's a comment in the, oh, it's from Austin. Hey, y'all, just a reminder that we have the first supplemental instruction session of the semester today, Wednesday at 8 p.m. Austin says he'll send the link for the MS Teams meeting after this class, so be on the lookout. Thank you, Austin. Appreciate you doing that, bud. Okay, so questions about the directed study guide before we get into content. If you don't feel like talking out loud, feel free to type in the comment section.
I have a question about them.
Please.
Okay, so I just wasn't sure if I was doing it right. So do we answer the headers, the subheaders, and the vocabulary, or just the subheaders and vocabulary?
Okay, Kelly, weren't you and I looking at them earlier, and it's subheaders and vocabulary? And so subheaders and content, because there's really not much to say with the headers.
Yeah, I thought it was the headers as well, and I was like, I am just repeating the same information. So, okay, that clears up a lot. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and so Kelly, as you and I are going through and counting the content for points, let's remember not to count the headers, right?
Yeah.
And so the subheaders and the vocab is where it's really at. So great question. Thank you, Ms. Conley.
Looks like we have
Okay, Miss Bird, that's a very important question, and there's something. Okay, I think your anxiety is partly my fault. Okay, so if a student is repeatedly, 2-3 times giving me directed study guides that are just copied and pasted out of the book, then I get upset and that's cheating. If in good faith, your efforts somewhat overlap with the words in the text, Kelly and I aren't worried about that. There's only so many ways you can rephrase Freud's oral stage of development, right? There's only so many ways you can rephrase what a statistic is. So I appreciate your fear. I would like you to ratchet it down, that if you can. If you're making a good faith effort, then you might lose points for originality, like if you're not terribly original. But if it's clear you're making a good faith effort, then we'll meet you there and we're not going to get upset, okay? And so if your unit check score is high, then we're going to highlight that and say, hey, your unit check score is really high. Okay, so Ms. Bird, feel free to ask for follow-up questions in the text box. Mr. Smith asks, if you are over 20% on unit check at all, is it not going to be graded? Well, see, that's tricky. There's what you guys see on your end, and there's what we see on ours. For example, let's say you just take the outline, the template that we've given you guys, and you re-upload the outline and it's blank. Unicheck remembers the outline, so 100% of the outline comes through as plagiarized, right? So a certain percentage of every one of your DSGs is going to come up as copied and pasted. And of course it will, because our outline is in the system. Okay, does that make sense? And so therefore, somebody might have done a really good job filling out the first half of their DSG and run out of time. And therefore, because all that's left in the second half is outline, all of that's going to be flagged as copied and pasted from the outline, right? So therefore, it's what that 20% means is if we're going through and taking out the outline, taking out everything else, if a bunch of your DSG is just copied and pasted over, I'm less likely to give you points, and I'm more likely to click on to the next assignment. Okay, so that 20%, unfortunately, I wish Unicheck was programmed to show you the metric that we use. Now, that's a great question. It used to be you could, but they keep changing things between Lumen, the creators of your textbook, and the people who write not the mastery quizzes, the chapter quizzes. Okay, so we got Lumen, and then we got the Unicheck people, and then we've got the Canvas people, and then we have Kelly and I, the instructors. And so you've got 4 different groups all trying to use and deliver material in the same format. So I don't have any control over Lumen, I don't have any control over Unicheck, and I have minimal control over Canvas. So if you wouldn't mind, you should have access to Unicheck if you're in this class. I'm not sure how though. So if any of you figure it out, would you post an announcement or ask us to post an announcement in class? Because it's perfectly reasonable that you all run your assignments through Unicheck. Now, what we see, and unfortunately it would be violation of FERPA for me to bring up what I see. What Unicheck shows me is it shows me a color code. So just glancing through in the margins of your DSG, so on the grade book, it'll say DSG1, and there's everybody's names and all of their DSGs. And there's a little flag on every one of them. And it goes green, pale green, you know, yellow, orange, yellow, red, deep red, right? There's that simple metric. So just glancing that the greens are all okay. And the vast majority of the DSGs, we looked at, what was it, like 70% of them were just beautiful green, right? So that shows that even if the Unicheck score on your end is a little high, that there was a clear good faith effort made. You're not going to lose many points for that, right? If any at all. In fact, usually after the teething problems of the first couple of weeks, people's DSG scores are very high. So Kelly, would you, in the spare time you don't have, would you poke around to see if in student view? Oh, Sadie, y'all can see the color code, but only after you've turned it in. Oh, okay, cool. So you guys can see that. If you're green, you're good. Just think of that. If Unicheck comes through on your grade book, it's green, it's good. Okay. So can we use keywords sometimes, or are sentences better? Hanukkah, that's a good question. Sentences are better in terms of helping me see that you're processing the content. One of the things that I do is, like, I come up with mnemonics a lot. So I will have a sentence and then a parenthesis with my mnemonic word, the one that is the trigger word for that content, okay? And so you can have your cake and eat it too. Have a little bit of a sentence, and then in parentheses, this is what unfolds this stuff, is this word. Okay, great questions. Thank you, guys. Okay. So as questions come up, again, feel free to speak out loud or type in the comments. I will read the comments out loud for those of you who can't just sit and who can't see the comments bar, because again, technology, right? Some people can't even see the comments bar. So I think that's particularly true if you're on like Android or Mac mobile, right? Okay. Where were we? We were going to start talking about research in psychology, I hope. Okay. Kelly, can you see what do psychologists study?
Yep.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to blow that up for y'all. Okay, so one of the themes I really hit hard last week is that psychologists have a really difficult challenge on their hands because we want to research objectively, verifiably, reliably material that isn't objective. And there are a lot of things about human experience that aren't necessarily reliable or verifiable. Like, we'll talk about consciousness in an upcoming unit. We can't even tell if other people around us are conscious. Like, your consciousness does not scientifically exist, right? Love doesn't scientifically exist. Spirituality, like so many of the things about human nature, doesn't meet the criteria of knowledge, which is a tradition we've inherited from the Romans. So it's that old. It's a couple thousand years old. So we can't really study essential things about human beings. What we can study are the operationalizations. Now, there are a few things that we can observe outwardly, directly, empirically. We'll get to that in a second. But for now, we look at human beings really in two broad domains, and then we'll break those down here even more in a minute. But psychologists typically measure thinking and behaving. So it's stuff that goes on internal to us, or that we believe goes on internal to us, as well as things that other people can count, right? Our outwardly observable, measurable behaviors. So the thinking and feeling stuff is very interesting to get into. And for those of you that are psychology majors, a class that I strongly encourage you to take is Russell Warren's Tests and Measurements class. Okay, Russell Warren, Dr. Warren, W-A-R-N-E, in our department, Tests and Measurements. It's one of the capstone courses available for psychology majors. Now, Dr. Warren is near and dear to my heart. He looks at psychology very, very differently than I do. It's one of the reasons why I like him so much. He's very rigorous, very intense, very methodical in his psychological research, but he very much thinks inside the box of psychology. I typically think outside the box, and then I start wondering about boxes, and then I start deconstructing boxes. He thinks inside the box very well. And one of his specializations is the pentultimate in thinking stuff, and that's IQ testing. I don't even think IQ exists. And it's fun for me to tease him because he not only thinks IQ exists, he's made quite a career for himself in researching IQ. So IQ, if you guys remember, stands for intelligence quotient, and we'll have a unit on this later in the semester. And what intelligence quotient means is your mental age over your chronological age. So if, for example, so I'm 49 years of age, for example, and if my mental age is 98 and my chronological age is 49, that's 98 over 49, which is, you know, a 200 IQ. It would be extraordinarily high. So that's where IQ started. This intelligence quotient measurement has taken on other forms and other definitions since. Again, it's something that I like teasing my colleagues who are experts in IQ is you guys keep changing the definition of what IQ is, and then you keep getting angry with, well, they don't get angry, that some of them take delight in my criticisms. I'm like, it doesn't even exist. Like, you guys keep changing the definition of it. So right now, IQ, intelligence quotient, is the quotient of number of items that you performed well on at an IQ test versus those you didn't. And the more of them you do well, the higher your IQ is, right? That's a radically different definition than mental age over chronological age. So there's a lot of effort that goes into this. In fact, again, when we cover IQ, we'll start sharing some of the things that psychologists use to measure IQ, how they've operationalized IQ. Now, again, by way of review, operationalization is when we find things that we can measure that relate to things we can't directly measure. And so we measure the things we can, hoping that those relate to the things we can't. And there are various pretty interesting and sophisticated methods psychologists have come up with to demonstrate their level of confidence that what they're measuring relates to the thing that they can't measure directly. So IQ tests, yeah, we'll have a whole measurement on that. Measurements of mood. There are two terms to get clear on in your psychological training, and that's mood and affect. Mood is how we feel inside, the emotions that are going on inside of us, okay? Affect is the emotion that we show to other people. Mood states are incredibly varied and complicated. And so we can have multiple moods going on at once. We can feel both grieving in some ways and content in some ways, and feel frustrated and grateful all at once. At the same time, that none of that necessarily is transmissible to other people. Like the other day, for example, I sat down at the dinner table, and one of my daughters, Diamelin, she sits over on my right, and she sat down and she had just this, you know, mildly thoughtful look on her face. And when I asked her what was going on, there were so many layers of emotion going on there that I had no idea just looking at her. So mood is our internal emotional state. Affect is the emotion that we show to other people. And in order for us to assess mood, we have to ask, okay? So I'd like to reiterate this. So I'm a psychologist. I've been doing counseling and psychotherapy things for, goodness gracious, 26 years. Saw my first client when I was 23. Whoa, okay, for 26 years. And I can't read people's moods, right? When my sweetheart is having a day, I don't necessarily know what's going on with her internally. I have to ask, right? And so one of the things that I encourage people to do is to practice speaking how they're feeling. Like Renee, for example, was kind enough to outline her thought process on a matter, her mood process on a matter. It was very helpful for me and very insightful. And so that's something I would encourage everyone to practice is let's get in touch with expressing how we're doing, okay? And there are times and a place, et cetera, that like, as I'm walking down the hallway and a colleague's walking the other way and says, how are you doing? And we don't have time for a conversation, I'm not going to deconstruct all of my mood states at that particular moment, right? But in a deep conversation with a friend, an email to a friend or colleague, right, that's a place where we can talk more about what's going on with us. So mood, again, you need to ask. And I would like to reiterate that please don't assume that because people love you that they should know what's going on with you internally. I've done a lot of couples counseling through the years, and it's interesting to me how often one member of the couple will say, well, I shouldn't have to say anything, they should just know. If they loved me, they should just know. And I'm like, I've been doing counseling for 26 years and I don't just know. I don't just know with my friends, I don't just know with my family, I don't just know with the people who come into my consultation, okay? So as complicated as mood is, affect is remarkably simple. And so you learn these really short lists of words when it comes to affect. Euthymic, dysthymic, agitated. Like there's a very short list of affect words, okay? And so in other courses, we'll define those in more detail. Just remember that mood is very complicated and you have to ask people directly. Affect, though, you can tell from the outside, but only in very broad and general terms. One of the things psychologists are also hired to do is measure people's opinions and how we ask the questions about a given phenomenon helps determine the answers that people give. The state of Utah, for example, the Utah Mental Health Association keeps sending me surveys to fill out, and I'll get like 2 or 3 pages into the surveys before I give up, and then they'll send it to me again and I'll get another page done, and then I get frustrated and they'll send it again because the way they've asked the questions predetermines certain responses. And so what's really fun is some of you actually may make a living working for business polling or political polling, etc. And the way you ask the question, like there was an obvious example is like when it comes to approval ratings for the President of the United States. Depending on how you ask that question, the approval ratings can vary as much as 20% just based on how you ask the questions. So psychologists are trained to ask the questions in the way to get the most valid answer. Unfortunately, some of my colleagues are sketchy AF and know how to modify how the questions are asked in order to elicit the kind of answer they want, right? So another thing that we measure is learning and memory. What's fascinating in psychology, though, is we can actually take learning, that construct, and shunt it down into behavior. Because to psychologists, learning is behavior. Memory is what happens internally to you. Like you remember facts, figures, definitions, etc. Learning, though, is often presumed to be behavioral. Okay? So there are ways where we can test memory. That's a lot of what classes are, is just testing memory. One of the things I chuckle at is I do appreciate that content is important to a degree, or I wouldn't be doing this. What's fun, though, are my colleagues who are psychologists have done a lot of research in the past 100 years about what students remember from classes, what content students remember, and what teachers can do to help facilitate the remembering of content. And time and again, they keep running into that if we were to sit down 5 years from now, and if I were to give you a final exam that's a version of, not the exact same, but a version of the final exam you took at the end of this class, you probably score about 60%. In fact, what's interesting is A, B, and C students will all score about the same, about 60%. And so some students are like, why am I killing myself for an A if in 5 years I'll remember somebody as much as somebody who got a C? Well, because learning how to succeed academically is a skill unto itself. But there's something else. It's not necessarily the content that keeps coming up as a theme, although it does. The theme that I'd like to point out is what's called incidental learning. Incidental learning are all the things we learn by being part of an academic milieu that aren't necessarily content driven, like hanging out in my office. Hopefully when I can have office hours again, face-to-face office hours, it's very common that people just hang out in my big old office and we just talk about stuff, life, the universe, and everything. And as we do so, that memory will stick with students far longer than my lecture on how we measure behavior, right? It's that special guest speaker that came, the getting to know the story of why the professor has the dogs he does. Those things stick with us as much, if not more, than content. And so that's part of our struggle with memory. Is it turns out a lot of the university experience is the experiences that develop in relation to other people, right? Your professors, your colleagues, if you work on campus, the people at work, that forms a lot of memory. And so just as an aside, one of the things we found is UVU alumni don't donate much money back to the institution. And there's two reasons for this. One reason is UVU alumni, although some of them are very financially successful, on average, UVU alumni are comfortably middle class after a few years, right? They don't have a ton of extra money to donate back to the institution. But that's actually a secondary reason. The primary reason is because we do not have on-campus housing. Like, we don't have the fanatical loyalty of a BYU, even though we're twice BYU size. Why? We don't have on-campus housing. We don't have the on-campus memory. We don't have we don't have the clubs that are, because no one else, you're stuck on campus, may as well join a bunch of clubs, may as well join a fraternity or sorority, right? All the stories people have about their roommates on campus, right? We don't have that. And therefore, when people think of UVU is a place they went to, took a class and left. Therefore, the memories that form in relation are sorely lacking. So people don't think to donate much. It wasn't as intense a relational experience as it was if they lived at the dorms at Utah State or University of Utah or Brigham Young. So that's why the debate about having dorms at UVU has been raging now for the 12 years I've been here. And personally, I'm a big fan. Unfortunately, they're very expensive. So, and I don't want costs to increase. So I'm on the horns of a dilemma. On the one hand, in the short run, it's going to be hugely expensive. On the long run, it typically pays off for institutions who have on-campus housing, but there's no guarantees. So again, stuff psychologists research. Now, behavior, outwardly observable acts, crowd behaviors. When I was a student at the University of Utah 100 years ago, traffic on I-15 was as bad as Los Angeles. Like, any time between about 4:30 and 6:30, if I wanted to go from, say, University of Utah to my job on 45th South, it was going to be about an hour-long commute. That's short a distance, right? And so psychologists started studying, why do people crowd? Like, where do traffic jams come from? And several things that they found is that people lack situational awareness and don't think ahead. And what's interesting is they found that even when the majority of people do, and they were very gratified to find that in the state of Utah, actually the majority of people driving are situationally aware and think ahead, it only takes 1 in 10 drivers to cause a massive traffic jam. And that's without an accident. So what they find is that there's a ripple effect. And so please don't replicate the study. It would be very dangerous. But imagine it's moderate traffic, right? It's not really thick, not bumper to bumper, but it's moderate traffic. The lanes are full, but everybody's moving. And somebody in the middle lane hits their brakes. The person behind them will hit their brakes, as well as the two people in the lanes next to them will also hit their brakes, and it creates this ripple effect. And then it takes another 1 in 10 person, you know, several car lengths down, not paying attention, looks up and there's brakes, and then they hit their brakes even harder, and then that ripples and that ripples, right? Next thing you know, traffic's at a standstill when there hasn't been an accident. Okay, it just takes 1 in 10. Likewise, there are now stoplights on the on-ramps, and when they first were installed, some of you may be old enough to remember this, those stoplights at the on-ramps would come on about 3 and turn off about 7. And they found that it's not necessary to have them on that long. And the number of minutes that those stoplights are on has gotten lower and lower and lower because there's only a few acute times of day when they're actually necessary. But by slowing people down as they're trying to merge into traffic, actually helps traffic move much more fluidly. Because what people normally do, again, it just takes the 1 in 10 to just bomb onto I-15, you know, forcing their way in for that brake lights to hit and the ripple effect to happen. So the other thing is rubbernecking. Rubbernecking means when there's an accident on the side of the road or flashing lights, people will stop and they'll slow down as they start, even if they don't hit their brakes. Their foot kind of comes off the gas as they're turning their heads, and they slow down, so the people behind them need to hit their brakes or there will be an accident. In fact, one of the things that psychologists have documented now for quite a while that it's not making a difference in behavior yet is, let's say traffic, again, is moderately thick, right? It's not super heavy, but it's moderately thick. And a highway patrolman doing his or her job pulls somebody over for speeding, right? That is now going to create a ripple effect, just pulling somebody over. And then with those bright lights, which will help keep, hopefully, and usually works, keep the officer safe as they've pulled somebody over, that's also going to inform rubbernecking, which means that people are going to be hitting their brakes. So it's one of those where I will pull somebody over to prevent an accident, but then when I do so, the likelihood of more accidents goes up, right? And so part of the diabolical issue in this particular research is that people who drive fast in traffic are more likely to be involved in fatal injuries, right? People who drive slow, though, are more likely to cause accidents, far more likely to cause accidents, but they're usually less fatal and less injurious. So the highway patrol is in a devil's dilemma, where if they stop pulling people over, then the number of fatalities will go up. But if they keep pulling people over, the number of overall accidents will stay high. So they're stuck in that catch-22. And so what they've decided, again, with the help of research psychologists, is it's better for them to save lives over property, rather, meaning cars, right? The value of cars. They'd rather have cars crashed than people dead. And that's really the decision they've had to make. So outwardly observable acts, so again, interpersonal dynamics. There's actually attempts to objectify and quantify interpersonal dynamics, how people converse with one another. There's a measure called the checklist of interpersonal transactions. And at first it was spelled CLIT, but for some reason the researchers decided that wasn't a good idea. So they spelled it CLOIT, cloit, rather than clit. And so, but the checklist of interpersonal transactions is something that I was trained in as a graduate student, where you actually have a clipboard with these statements. Are these following things happen? And you just check those off. And then it will tell you about this person's style of relating to this person. Their effort, though, was noble, because one of the things that we can't do with our Roman philosophical heritage is actually measure a relationship. We can measure what person A does and person B does, but we can't measure the relationship they uniquely form. And so the authors of the checklist of interpersonal transactions were trying to measure the relationship between me and you. Well, they know it too. They utterly failed, because you measure one person and the other person, and then you make an argument for what the relationship is. But in actuality, you're just measuring this person's behavior and this person's behavior. You're not measuring the relationship itself. Okay, consumer behavior. There are some of my colleagues who make a lot more than I do as a therapist and university professor by working for Walmart. it's really fun for me, all the psychological tricks that Walmart uses to get people to go to their stores. Oh, and it's not just Walmart, okay? But Walmart's one of my favorite whipping boys. I haven't been inside a Walmart in a long time, and if you ever see me inside a Walmart, you know that the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are riding out. In fact, I'm the 5th horseman. You know, there's death, famine, war, pestilence. There's Draper in a Walmart. You know things are going really bad. And so when I go to Walmart, I'm both amused and annoyed because I can see all the psychological tricks that they're pulling. The way the lighting is done, psychologists came up with that. Like many of your small town grocers, you know, like Reams, Allen's back in the day, they used yellow lights on the inside. And so Walmart's researchers found that if you use white light, especially natural seeming light, everything in the store feels brighter, and people like that. The other thing they found is that people don't like to feel crowded, and so they widened the aisles. Walmart stores, for the amount, and they've got a lot of stuff in them, but relative to the amount of stuff they have, their aisles are abnormally wide, hence their stores are abnormally large, okay? The other thing that psychologists found is people love the illusion of choice, meaning that you take a given person, they would rather go to a store that has 50 mustards rather than a store that only has their favorite mustard. Even though they buy the same damn mustard every time, they like the illusion of choice, meaning just because I always choose the same thing doesn't mean that I don't want options, even though I'll never take the options that you present to me. Again, all of these things are researched out by psychologists. Like there was a consultation gig I was peripherally involved in, like, oh my gosh, almost 20 years ago now. It seems like just yesterday. And that was for Old Navy. Old Navy back in the day, you'd walk in and they would just have tables and shelves just overflowing with merchandise. Like if I wanted to find, well, they don't sell pants in my size or anything else, but if I was shopping for my daughters or my sons and I go into Old Navy, you'd have to dig through just piles of clothes to find something that was the right size. And the aisles were narrow, it was crowded feeling, and they were struggling financially. So psychologists came in and said, okay, the first thing, they just glanced at the store and said, cut down the amount of merchandise on your floor by half and widen your aisles by double. And they said, what? But we want options and the illusion of choice. And so the psychologists they hired actually helped them give the illusion of choice while increasing their lighting and the aisles to make the shopping experience more palatable or more comfortable for customers. And lo and behold, it worked brilliantly. Old Navy sales went the next year after they redesigned the floor plans of their stores. So relationships is another thing that we psychologists look at, and that's like something that's near and dear to me is like group therapy interactions, familial interactions, couple interactions. When we look at how people behave, it's very interesting, and how people's behavior changes depending on the constitution of members of the current group they're in, whether it's family group, friend group, group therapy, a classroom, right? That our behavior changes depending on the context of who we're around. Like, I was talking to a colleague of mine last semester, and she was saying, oh, do you know so-and-so and so-and-so? They're taking your class, they just love your class. And I said, no, I don't know either of these students. And she goes, but they were just in your class. And I said, but I don't know them. I used to start every semester with memorizing every student's name in my face-to-face classes, right? By the end of the first day of class, I'd have a good feeling. By the end of the first week, I would know everybody by name. But some students didn't like being known by me, and they were very vocal in my student evaluations. And so I stopped doing that. Instead, I just say, if you want to be known by me, make yourself known, and I will know you. And so that's been my philosophy since, and it works great. Well, what's interesting is these two students are very outspoken in my colleague's class, but sat at the back of the room and were very carefully taupe colored. They were the same, like they would paint themselves the same color as the wall behind them, metaphorically speaking, in order not to be seen by me. And it was really fun that me as a professor, they've experienced the relationship very differently than her, my colleague, is a professor. So therefore, they responded very differently. And that's something that we psychologists are interested in. Why is it around certain people you're very outspoken and around other people you're very shy? What is it about that relationship? What we're very quick to do as psychologists is to turn individuals into the variables. Okay? Like, you are this type of person, we've diagnosed your personality, therefore your students respond in this way, right? But what that does is then it leaves out the students. So psychologists will flip that around and then they'll measure the student. Oh, the student's personality is this in this way. But again, what we have never figured out how to do is measure the relationship. Like, stepping outside of classroom dynamics, for example, I've just been intrigued through the years watching. I'm blessed to have a lot of friends, and watching my friends date, and some relationships work and some not. I've noticed there's a trend where I can have friend A, who is lovely, brilliant, insightful, warm, caring, just one of my favorite people, and friend B, lovely, caring, warm, brilliant, one of my favorite people. And yet when they started dating each other, they both went toxic, poisonous, septic, right? And not towards me, thankfully, but towards each other. And so after 5 years of horrible, abusive, toxic back and forth and trying to triangulate their friends and get their families involved and everything, and then they split up, they're back to their lovely selves again. And then later, these friends have gone on to date or marry other people, and everything went great. So one of the things that is a challenge for a psychologist, why is person A and person B, who are perfectly healthy on their own and perfectly healthy in other relationships, when you put them together, that relationship is toxic? Like, why? We don't know, because we can't measure relationships. But it is something we're curious about. So let me check to see if there have been any comments or questions while I've been doing this. Okay. Renee, it's helpful to be asked about our moods too, because for those of us who have few facial expressions, quote unquote flat affect, I'm glad you know that term, Renee. In many situations, it's not always clear to others how we feel. Likewise, being able to communicate one's mood is helpful, as we've talked about. Yes, it is. In fact, like just reading mood states, for example, there are various terms that we use. One is labile. That's when somebody's affect, not their mood, but their affect is all over the place. Like, if we were to give a scale from somebody's on a 10 scale, like 5 being fine, right? 10 being very energetic, and 0 being utterly lacking in energy. Labile is when they're doing this, right? These radical affect swings. They're not mood swings, because again, we can't measure mood. So that's labile. Then there's blunted, okay? Blunted is where, say, the normal range of affect is this. Blunted is where it's much narrower, right? And then there's flat, meaning that they don't give any vibes affectively. It's hard for us to tell because they're just not emoting in a way that's obvious. And so those are some of the terms you'll learn in the abnormal psychology class and in your counseling and psychotherapy class. We'll go over into detail. So I hit that harder in abnormal than I do in counseling. In counseling, it's more the philosophies of and practices of psychotherapy. Can you say hi, Ninja? No, you're too busy looking over your shoulder. You're a good boy. You're such a good boy. Okay. So thank you, Renee. So there are 3 levels that we do our research at, right? 3 levels. So that's the level of the brain, the level of the person, and the level of the group. I'm going to hit it today. I know I only have 3 minutes, but there is a strong growing assumption in psychology, and that's philosophical materialism. Philosophical materialism is the belief that what is true for you about your essential personhood, your thoughts, feelings, desires, how you relate, your personality, your IQ, whether or not you have addictions or struggles, is all because of your genetics, right? All because of your biology, your neurochemistry, your neuroanatomy, and your genetics. And so That's a big assumption in the field that's growing. And so more and more psychologists are looking to the body and looking to the flesh to see what is true of people. So there's a lot going on there. And so neuropsychology is a booming field. Level of person, I'd like to make a quick point about level of person. And that is, we have a struggle in psychology. We have a philosophical assumption going in that hampers us, but we don't even know we have the assumption until people like me come and say, hey, here's this assumption. And that's the issue of data and what data we privilege. So there are two types of data that we can gather, nomothetic and idiographic. Nomothetic is data that is gathered across groups of individuals. And this is what we do in psychology. Like we look at the average IQ, the average pant size, the average personality type or the average personality score, the average level of pathology. We take hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of data points, and we take the averages, right? The normal curve that you'll see over and over again in our field, which means that we don't really see the individual. We're always comparing to a norm. Like for crying out loud, I teach a class called abnormal psychology. What the hell is a normal psychology? Could we have a normal psychology class, right? That nomothetic is where we're always looking at averages. So it breaks my heart. Because again, what's lost is the data from the individual. This is idiographic. Idiographic is where rather than me constantly comparing you to a norm or an average, instead I look at the data as coherent that you are generating. So I look at you as a case study. So think of nomothetic as study on groups. Idiographic data is case study data. There are many reasons why this hits near and dear to my heart. Let's take a medical example. Like some of you have probably had this experience where you're going to the doctor again and again and again and again for a series of health problems, and they keep looking at it nomothetically, and they keep looking at your symptoms in isolation to other bodily systems. And so finally, after years, I found a physician who took me up as a case study, where he and I did experiments with medication, with regimens, etc., on me personally in order to find what worked. And it took me years to find that physician. And he wasn't trained on how to do case studies. I taught him how to do case studies and say, let's make sure I don't do anything dangerous while we research how to solve this health problem. And it worked, but it took years to find a physician that was willing to do that. Okay, likewise in psychotherapy. Do we want to be diagnosed according to a manual based on averages? Or do we want the therapist to relate to us and see how our thinking, feeling, and behaving makes sense in the context of our life world, not in the context of the averages reported in the DSM? Okay, and so wouldn't it be nice to have therapists who take us up as individual case studies? Now, the reason I say psychology has largely lost this as a field, we don't even have case study journals anymore, which breaks my heart because that's how therapists usually learn, is best is through case studies. Okay, so it looks like I'm running out of time for today. So on Friday, today's Wednesday already, if you can believe it, on Friday, what I'm going to do is give an example of psychological research, a very famous psychological study, and I'm going to deconstruct it. And first of all, because I love doing that, and second of all, because I would really like you all to see that very little psychological research is done well. Even famous studies are often deeply problematic when you really examine them and see what goes on behind the scenes. So thank you all very much for hanging out today, and I will look forward to seeing you all on Friday. So bye-bye, everybody.